Ja comencem, ok?
Yes.
Sí, sí,
Hello! Començo ja, Montse?
sí, 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 puedo.
Hello and welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. I am your host, Carles Salazar. I'm talking to you from Lleida, in Catalonia. Conversations in Culture and Evolution is a product of the Catalan of work group of the Catalan Institute of Anthropology that goes with the name Culture and Evolution. And in this work group, we are some anthropologists and archaeologists and happy with the way in which our disciplines were treating Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection and the relationship between biology and culture in the explanation of human behavior. And in order to compensate for what we understand as a deficiency, we created this group. Now, today, our guest is very special guest. We are privileged and honored to have as our guest Professor Scott Atran. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Carlos. Nice to be with you.
Welcome to Conversations in Culture and Evolution. Now, Scott Atran is an American-French cultural anthropologist who is Emeritus Director of Research in Anthropology at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris, research professor at the University of Michigan, and co-founder of Artists International and of the Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflicts at Oxford University. Professor Atran is one of the pioneers in the cognitive and evolutionary approach to the study of culture. He has studied and written about terrorism, violence, religion, indigenous environmental management, and the cross-cultural foundation of biological classifications. And he has done fieldwork with terrorists and Islamic fundamentalists, as well as political leaders and Native American peoples. And let me just show you some of the works of Professor Atran. Now, here you see this book. The titles are already, as you can see, very interesting. Cognitive Foundations of Natural Science Towards an Anthropology of Religion. These are the one Folk Biology, edited together with Douglas Medin. And here we have three more. In Gods We Trust, The Evolutionary Landscape of Religion. And that one is it's a bilingual edition, Plants of the Petén Itzá Maya, Plantas de los Maya Itzá del Petén. And the other is the Native Mind, and the Cultural Construction of Nature. Also written together with Douglas Medin, and Talking to the Enemy, Faith, Brotherhood, and the Making or Unmaking of Terrorists. Now, let me emphasize perhaps the most remarkable things about Professor Atran research is that he makes compatible two branches of research which I think are very difficult sometimes to bring together, which is a very theoretically developed approach to anthropology on the one hand, and a very applied anthropology as well. As you can see from some of the titles, he's done research on topics that go well beyond which is merely academic interest, such as the study of Islamic terrorists, and in addition, research that in anthropology, by the means of anthropological research, such as participant observation, is likely to be a dangerous research. Now, let me, Scott, let me start by asking you the question that we ask all our guests. In what way has Darwinian theory been relevant to your research? And in what way do you think that Darwinian theory, theory of evolution by natural selection, is relevant to cultural anthropology?
Well, if you accept the theory of evolution, then human beings are the product of actually several billion years of evolution. They are the endpoint of one particular branch. And understanding some of the basics of evolution allow you to understand some of the basics of human beings and their behavior.
Now, you have also been one of the pioneers in the anthropological study of science. What can anthropologists say about science? Why do you think that should be a topic of interest for anthropological research?
Well, science is a historical development, just like any cultural development, a very particularly interesting one and a very powerful one. And anthropologists generally haven't looked into it. Sort of a branch of cognitive science. Most of anthropology that's looked into science has looked into the social dynamics of some particular scientist or particular group of scientists in producing whatever they produce. I'm not very much interested in that. I'm not interested in the individual psychological processes that go into making Darwin Darwin or Einstein Einstein. I mean, I read about it and I find it very interesting, but I'm interested mostly in the outcomes of what the scientists produce and how those outcomes um, build on one another to produce science that we know today.
Yeah, because
What
because
what is the historical process, the larger macro historical process, as opposed again to the individual psychology? Although individual psychology can sometimes give us some insights into that historical process as well.
well, in the social sciences, there is this tradition of science and technology studies, but I believe that your approach to the study of science is very different from the
Yeah, I
science
mean,
and
my
technology.
interest, for example, is what makes physics possible,
Yeah,
what makes biology possible, what makes geometry possible, or mathematics. What is it about the human mind and about human beings' history, if you want, that make these particular achievements possible? Um, and they're quite peculiar and powerful achievements. What is it about the relationship between human beings and the world around them that makes us able to map that world in pretty veridical ways, at least for some domains, for mathematics, physics, and now biology. Although for the human sciences, we're much less able to develop interesting or adequate theories.
that's right. But it's the natural sciences that your main object
Yes.
of research, right?
Yes, there, because there we see a regular progression, increase in knowledge and in theoretical sophistication, while in the human sciences, we don't. In the human sciences, basically, we're, except for a very few areas, we're basically where we were, when Socrates and Plato and Aristotle were contemplating these things 2,400 years ago.
That's right. But another interesting thing about science, I think, if you look at science from an anthropological point of view, is that it is very unusual in human history or in human societies. I mean, we have science here in the West, but it began scientific revolution. But for most of our history, I mean, scientific knowledge was not there. What would that be the reason for that?
Well, the Greeks had, and the Egyptians, of course, and even the Babylonians and the Maya had rudiments of what we would call
Yeah,
science
yeah,
today. But it was during the age of exploration when the European powers began to go over the world and see many aspects of the world that they hadn't originally understood and tried to integrate those different aspects of the world that science was really born.
all right, yeah. Well, another field of your research has been the anthropology of religion. And let me quote from your book, In Gods We Trust. You wrote, even the apparently incommensurable aspects of different cultural groups are only conceivable against a rich background of universally commensurable beliefs. If these weren't true, anthropology would be impossible. I think that should be a very obvious
Yes, I think so
statement.
too.
However, it seems to me that many anthropologists would find that rather implausible. Why do you think that should be?
Well, I think there are a few reasons. One of the reasons is that anthropologists want to think that the people they study are very different from everybody else, and somehow they've found some way into understanding them that's unique and different, and they've gone through some kind of mysterious rite of passage that allows them that particular privileged knowledge. And then there's also the idea that well, there are two aspects of the notion that there are universal beliefs. One is that whatever universal beliefs are proposed by anthropologists, especially Western anthropologists, where anthropology was really born, is some kind of theoretical chauvinism and an attempt to impose basically what are Western beliefs on the rest of the world. And also the notion that if there are universal beliefs, then adaptation and variation and diversity are harder to come by. I don't think any of that is true, but I think that's one of the reasons that a couple of the reasons that people don't like to what you or I would consider to be absolutely obvious. I mean, any anthropologist gets plunked down anywhere in the world, and they can basically come to an understanding, more or less, of what's going on around them. Now, I have two sort of mentors. I was assistant to Margaret Mead at the American Museum of Natural History. And back in 1926, she was plumped down in the middle of New Guinea, sometimes with cannibalistic groups. They would dress her up as a pig and take her up because she was white, the first white person they had ever. Then they'd take her up and sing pig songs. But after, actually after just 6 weeks, she began to understand them, and they began to understand her, to the point that she was able to do, structures of their languages and kinship systems and things like that. On the other hand, Levi Strauss, who I worked with years ago, he went up the Amazon. He was actually trained in philosophy, but he got this job in Sao Paulo to be a sort of anthropologist, and he went up the Amazon. And as he was going up, the further he got away from population centers, the more difficulty he had in understanding peoples, to the point where he actually said, well, I've got to stop here because I really don't understand what was going on. My take on this, and I've discussed, my take on this is that he was just limited in time. Had he decided to spend, a year or two with them, even the ones he wasn't understanding, he would have understood them.
Yeah, that's true.
Not that he
Oh,
would have understood everything. I mean, people live deep lives, and sometimes cultural lives are very subtle, and there are times when things come out that you wouldn't have expected, that only people who have been immersed in this since childhood can readily understand. But for the most part, anyone can understand anyone else if given enough time. And that
uh,
means that we all have basically the same capacities and uh, ability to understand the world, the same basic tools.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned these two great figures of anthropology, Margaret Mead and Levi Strauss, because Margaret Mead was for a long time the representative of cultural relativism,
See, I think that's a canard.
all right.
I've been trying to correct. I used to have strong conversations with friends of mine, Steve Pinker or Dan Dennett, who would quote Mead and say that she was a cultural relativist. You have to understand, back in the 1920s and 30s, when Boas's students and colleagues like Benedict and Mead were going out into the world, fascism was on the rise, and
That's
fascism
right.
had a very particular view of human nature, of human hierarchies, and they were fighting against that. I think rightly so. And that was wrongly interpreted as a sort of relativism. Now, I mean, a rank cultural relativism. Back in 1974, I asked Mead about this, and I said, to what extent do you really believe that cultures are really relative? And she says, well, my mind keeps changing as I learn new things. And with her help, I was able to organize a meeting between Noam Chomsky and Jean Piaget and François Jacob and Jacques Mondon and Levi Strauss and some others in Paris for a few days. We were stuck in a monastery where I asked them to explore the question of universals.
Right.
And my conclusion at the end of that was that Chomsky was probably pretty right, and
Right.
that Piaget was not wrong, but I think not quite right. I feel the same way. I think you had a guest, Michael Tomasello, uh,
That's right. Yeah.
some while ago, and although I admire much of his work, I think his views on those kinds of things are similar to
Right. Yeah.
Piaget's. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know. I mean that Margaret Mead is the different. The young Margaret Mead of say coming of age in Samoa and sex and temperament is not the same as the Margaret Mead of male and female. I think it was one of the books that she published much later, where
But
she
she quite encouraged me to go into evolutionary thinking. In fact,
oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
my first work was at Columbia University, where I was an anthropologist, and that has a long history of anthropology. Was on human uh, Anthropocene skulls, where I was doing endocasts, trying to figure out what from the interior molds of hominid skeletons and skulls I could more or less speculate about the evolution of cognition. Very little can be done, but something can be done. And
Right.
I remember when Richard Leakey came to visit us, I spent some time with him
Mm.
also, working quite a bit on human evolution. And again, Mead, who was my advisor at the time, was very encouraging about that.
Right. 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 That's very interesting point to remark because we have this stereotype that Margaret Mead just the cultural relativist and
No,
that's it.
not even Geertz, who I knew was the rank cultural relativist. People think
Oh, Clifford Geertz, right. Yeah, that's true. Let me go in a bit more detail in your research in the anthropology of science, because one of the things that you study is folk biology and systems of classification of plants and animals. And one of the things that you said is that those systems have an a fundamental innate component. And it seemed to me that, again, that seems to go against this received wisdom in anthropology that goes as far back as Durkheim, with Durkheim and Morse, that when they published these primitive classifications, where the main point was to see that it was society that produces those classifications. So why do you think this innate component should be emphasized then?
well, I mean, everywhere I've gone in the world, people basically have the same structure of biological classification. And it's not just people wrongly think that it's just a set of categories and maybe hierarchy, but it is a very actually formally, I've described it and mathematically, it's quite a peculiar structure. It's not a hierarchy of groups within groups. It's a set of classes of classes. So, for example, what is the commonality between a lemon tree, chicken, and a beetle? And they all belong to the same level of reality. Now, where are you going to get that from sort of simply observing the world? Um, and then those classes of classes are embedded in a hierarchy of different systems of classes. So we have higher and lower classes, as Darwin said, that are not arbitrary like the constellations of the heavens across cultures. They're basically the same. And not only is the structure, the basic structure of what we would call species today, basically the same, and higher order groups of species, but it's the inference patterns that are the most compelling because um, what what when we want to call in biological cognition the principle of diversity. Um, if you find something that's common to a mouse and a rat, that has, and you go up the tree, of course, you can make that inference, and it has some some generalizability. But if you come up with something like from an E. coli and a human being, which are at the extreme ends of different hierarchies, and they have commonality, then you go, oh my God, maybe this is true of all creatures. Now, where does that inference come from? Well, the inference comes from the fact that you can go up this tree and you look at what's at the bottom of this tree, which one has properties. If the properties are common at the bottom, you just assume wherever they connect up, that's everything in between has them. Now, that's the most powerful inference scheme I know of. And again, it just didn't spring up sui generis like Athena from the head of Zeus, or for spontaneously by some cultural interaction in each society. It had to come from, and it's built on particular kinds of what we would call conceptual predicates. And those conceptual predicates, just to be understood, you have to have those conceptual predicates in mind beforehand. Otherwise, you can't assimilate them. And again, they're very peculiar. They're not like anything else. They're not like artifacts or so where do they come from? Well, if they're not innate, uh, maybe they came from Mars. I don't. But it's
Right.
much more likely, given the fact that human beings have had to adapt to their biological environment over the last, 1,200,000 years, that they evolved this capacity to build these systems.
Right. Well, that brings in this issue of the relevance of evolutionary psychology. As you know, evolutionary psychology is this discipline that began to develop in the late 20th century. And in a way, it appeared to be a kind of rival to anthropology, or many anthropologists saw. I mean, I didn't see it that way. So it was a good contribution to what we were doing. But
Well, I mean, especially in the United States and to a lesser extent in continental Europe and the UK, um, again, after fascism and the notion that there were these sort of rigid genetic hierarchies built into races, there was a political tendency to dismiss anything to do with genetics uh, and evolved habits as latent fascism. And of course, evolutionary theory wasn't like that at all at the beginning, except for Darwin and people like him. But certainly, it's true that when people like Rudolf Hess said that Nazism is simply applied biology and anthropology, that particular view, evolutionary view, um, fell into disrepute. Um, and then there was also the legacy of colonialism and the Vietnam War, and the idea that everybody has their own means of expression, their own way of expressing themselves, and that attempts to apply um, general theories and general views of what language is or like what cognition is an attempt to mask or even obliterate the important differences that are actually disappearing across the world and that uh, should be safeguarded instead. As Geertz said, at least to me once, the aim of anthropology nowadays should be to awe people with the diversity that's left in the world. Again, that's different from the my own history and interests. Although, my interactions with people like that have all been rather productive, and I always invite them to used to when I was doing seminars, invited them to my seminars
right.
to give talks. But I'm much more interested in understanding what is common to human beings so that I can understand their differences.
Yeah.
And the differences I'm interested in understanding are the differences that are most alien to me.
Right.
Terence, the Roman playwright, had this expression that everything alien to me is still human.
That's
And
right.
so I am not, you know, take folk biology, take biology. So, you have all these campers and wilderness people, and they go out into the wilderness and try to survive. Um, if you actually left them alone in the Amazon or in the Petan jungle with people I've been studying, I don't think they last 2 or 3 days. So what is it about these people that allow them to live in basically extremely primitive conditions, that is, no material means other than rudimentary tools and objects, and yet survive in complete equilibrium in very hostile environments? Now, again, if I was let alone there, I'd be dead shortly. So I'm interested in understanding, how is that possible and what made that possible? And where did it go from there? For example, how did Maya civilization grow out of that? So that's why I was interested in that. For suicide terrorists, it was something different. They're the people who are most peculiar to me. That is, why would you go out and blow up bunches of innocent, masses of people innocent of any direct harm to you or anybody you know? Why would you kill them? So understanding that became a very important thing for me. I'd also like to understand, like, why I am not Lucien Pavarotti. Why, how music is created where I'm incapable. I don't have that talent at all. It reminds me of I don't know, a conversation with Levi Strauss. I said, "How did you ever become an anthropologist?" And he said, "It was a complete accident. I wanted to be a musician."
Musician.
A musician. I wanted to
Imagine
be,
that.
and I realized I had no talent at all. Right? So I would figure out, how could I be a musician in another domain?
All
And
right. Oh, that's
anthropo
true.
anthropology fell out.
Oh, that's why he was putting all these titles in his in the
Yeah,
mythologic.
overture and yes.
Yeah. Very interesting. Um, Now, one of the fields that you have done research is, as I said at the beginning, anthropology of religion. Um, I think one of the questions that you really address in your book, In Gods We Trust, which I think is the most basic question that anthropology of religion should address, is why do humans have religion at all? Given the fact that religious beliefs are apparently so unrealistic or so counterintuitive, how come? How can we explain the practical universality of religion?
It's not only that they're absurd, it's that we make very costly commitments to them.
That's right.
People make even at the cost of their own lives and the cost of the lives of they hold dear. So why have this thing at all? Now, there are sort of two within the evolutionary tradition, there are sort of two directions this takes. One is what's called the adaptationist view, that religion is basically an adaptation. I'm not terribly sure, to cooperation or something, like to increase cooperation, to lower transaction costs and mobilizing people for defense, things like that. And of course, it does fill this. My basic opposition to evolutionary explanations in terms of adaptation is they're just so stories. You give me any two things. I mean, there's this experiment in cognitive psychology where you give two random items, a broom and an airplane, and human beings can spontaneously come up with a causal story linking the two.
Hmm.
And I think that's basically true of evolutionary um, adaptational arguments. Now, sometimes it's clear. Sometimes we have a clear evolutionary progression of adaptations through species and across our own species. At other times we don't. For example, language, there's no clear. There seems to be a sudden uh, precipice, uh, a sudden computational mutation in the brain, if you want to put it that way, that differentiates human language from anything that came before it. Now, of course, you can say, well, you can teach chimpanzees to do this or to do that, and to learn this ostentation or to do this little trick in theory of mind. But it's like saying, well, there's no difference between flying and having a chimpanzee jump higher and higher and higher, and maybe you'll eventually fly. Um, and then there's this sort of byproduct view, which is basically my view, is that we have all these evolved capacities, some very peculiar, some very particular, just like squirrel monkeys have a very peculiar adaptation to understand squirrel monkey hands, which we have no ability to differentiate, but they can distinguish dozens of different squirrel monkeys just by their hand shape. Just like human beings can distinguish human beings from just a quarter of their facial profile because we have this facial recognition capacity that other species don't for human beings. Um, but we have these adaptations, and once cognition gets kicked in, we have a sort of uh, ability to integrate these different capacities. You might call this a meta module, which puts together all the modules. And of course, language is the means of communication among these different modular systems. Um, then what happens is these different systems can be used for things that they had no evolutionary basis in. Let me give you an example. Frogs have an innate ability to eat flying insects. So if you pass flying insects across the field of vision of a frog, its tongue will lash out to eat it. In fact, when we had this mosquito invasion in our field station in Peten, I had all the people from the village bring in frogs to eat all the mosquitoes. On the other hand, if you wave a little black thing on a thread in front of the frog, it'll do the same thing. Okay? That's because it's overdetermined. Evolutionary capacities are overdetermined. And human beings have all sorts of um, adaptive domains that take on a immense uh, field of operation beyond their adaptive basis. Give you an example. Pornography. I mean, pixels on a screen or glossy pictures in a magazine have no apparent um, adaptive value, yet human beings get excited just all the same. In fact, terribly so, so that it becomes a real social problem. Same thing with sugar or fat. You know, in the wild, animals don't just come out and say, "Hi, eat me." It's really hard. I don't know. And I've done a lot of hunting, you know, survival hunting. Animals are very good at hiding themselves and being difficult to catch. And so protein is very difficult to get in the wild. And human beings are basically evolved to take it in whenever they can find it. Same with sugar, which is essential to our metabolism. But if you think about where it exists in nature, it exists in quite rare places. In some berries, you have to be very particular. Honey is extremely rare. Other sorts of foods have relatively low sugar. So we're also built to take in sugars whenever we can. But the problem is the fast food industries, right? They have realized this evolutionary proclivity we have and just stuff us. And of course, you know, it creates things like obesity, or for Native Americans, it creates diabetes in enormous proportions because they have had no time whatsoever to adapt relative to, say, Europeans in terms of these processing foods. And our cognition is pretty much the same thing. Take kinship, for instance. Of course, we evolved to favor our genetic relatives, and there's obvious reasons for that in evolutionary theory. Includes we want our genes more than we want our bodies. We want our genes to survive, and that's why we sacrifice ourselves for our children. Most people would, more or less, or at least make very costly commitments. And as you go further and further genetically from the base, you know, we're willing to do it for our parents too, to a bit, our cousins a little less. By the time we get to strangers, much less. Okay, but how do you build large cooperative societies? And building large cooperative societies is of strangers requires either abandoning kinship altogether, which we're not going to do, or somehow um, upstreaming it, upscaling it. And we do that through fictitious or imagined kinship. There's no political movement I know in recorded history, and probably anywhere, where it's not described in terms of brothers and sisters and motherlands and fatherlands, because we manage to integrate this into our innate sort of kin psychology, and it becomes extremely powerful. And then there are incentives to make that even more powerful than our original kin-based psychology. So, for example, political orders in human history developed only when that imagined kinship became stronger than our genetic kinship. Of course, the parable of that is Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac for, as Durkheim would say, God is group, right? So we were able to, it established possibilities for trust and cooperation much greater. Now that's just one of the mechanisms. Religion is another one. Nationalism is another one. Nationalism is very similar to religion in so many ways. Ceremonies and parades and sacrifice and all this. In fact, it's the sort of modern religion. Um, and religions help us do that, but religion does something that the others, like nationalism, doesn't, and that is it solves existential problems. So, for example, loneliness, death. So, for all biological creatures, the avoidance of death is the primary evolutionary imperative in terms of individual cognition. And everything that we evolved with, we evolved in part to avoid death. Now, no creature but humans have any notion of an impending death. But human beings have what I would call the tragedy of cognition. That is, they're able to see far into the future, and the evidence is so overwhelming that we're going to die. Now, what do we do? Do we just collapse in despair? Do we try to manipulate things that are? No, we invent possible worlds where we overcome this, and we overcome this through religious sentiments.
Yeah, and the tragedy of death is not just the death of the self, but the death of significant others. That is,
That's right. And religions with apparently absurd beliefs allow cooperation that other systems don't because, well, I shouldn't call it a system. It's actually something much more complex. Because if you're willing to sacrifice for apparently absurd beliefs, then you can be trusted.
that's right.
More than for anything else. And it is the absurd beliefs they're not just, it's not that they're empirically false. They're much more than that. They're absurd. Aristotle had this categorization between false beliefs and counterintuitive beliefs, categorical beliefs. He said, for example, quadrupedal idea is a category mistake. These are things that just don't go together. You can't even put them together. They don't make sense.
Right.
And in religion, we do that all the time, but we do it in a very peculiar way. And that's what I did in my book, try to describe the actual structural mechanisms. I mean, nobody has a religion where we have quadrupedal ideas just on Thursdays after dinner. I mean, there are particular limitations on the kinds of ideas that are absurd that human beings can plausibly entertain. And we have them in different registers. For example, take the Mass, the Catholic Mass, where you take the body and blood of Christ. Now, I doubt there's one sort of Hannibal Lecter there, but they're not cannibals. People who go to Mass, they understand the difference. Yet you can still believe in a different register, and I try to describe what that register is,
That's right.
that you are taking in the body and blood of Christ. But it's quite separate from the everyday empirical world, and we navigate these two worlds very differently.
Right. Now, I'm following this study of religion and perhaps Well, the in the difference between the adaptation, I mean, should culture be seen as an adaptation as a byproduct? Another approach that you have also criticized is the mimetic approach, or the theory that cultures are just memes. But that agrees with the byproduct view, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
no, no. Memes,
No.
memes is fine. Dawkins, actually, it was David Hull who first came up with. There are other people who come up with this, but Dawkins sort of made it very popular.
Yeah.
Um, it's the idea that you have um, these ideas which are free flowing, like genes, and they combine with one another, and they invade minds and take them over and whatnot, and they reproduce. Uh, Very little that human beings do cognitively involves reproduction. Um, when you repeat a verse in a song, yeah, then you're reproducing. Or these letters that people used to do when you were young and say, retransmit this to somebody else in this chain, where you're
Right.
literally reproducing it. Almost everything human beings do in communication is by inference. We have very elliptical
That's
ways of
right.
communication, and we fill it in with background knowledge and very, very deep knowledge systems. There's almost no reproduction. And if there's no reproduction or very little reproduction, then everything that's describing the sort of mimetic approach to cultural evolution can't be right. Let me just give you an example of an experiment I did in my class. So I had the Ten Commandments,
Right.
because at the time, um, especially among the Christian evangelicals, they were saying, well, it's meant the same thing since Moses' time as today. So my object was to show that's not the case, and at the same time to show that mimetic theory is not correct. So I put the Ten Commandments on the board, and I had a student come in and pick out a commandment, and then someone else who was on the outside comes through the door, and that student, the board is erased, and the student must paraphrase that commandment and give it to the next student. And I do this through 10 iterations. Okay. By the 10th iteration, no one could understand the original commandment. I put them all back on the board, and
Mm.
nobody got them right, because by the time it was like, thou shalt not bow down before false idols, it was, I should be nicer to my wife on Sundays, or money isn't everything, or whatever. It was like Mao's little red book, billion Chinese have it in the air, but each one thinks about something different. The only people who paraphrased it in such a way that the 10th person was able to understand the original commandment were autistics,
Right.
because they literally repeated it like, thou shalt not bow down before false items. They would say, you can't kneel before a false statue or something like that. So by the time the 10th person, they understood that. But all the other people, they were doing massive degrees of inference and relating to their own knowledge systems,
Right. Right. Right.
which is why we have rabbis and priests and imams reinterpreting the Quran and the Bible uh, every week to mean something new,
Right.
uh, to infer what it should be relevant for today. And I think most of what human beings do in terms of their thinking and communication is much more interpretation than it is reproduction. And therefore, I don't think the mimetics is anything but a nice, cute metaphor for anything you want it to be.
Right. Yeah. No, what I found interesting in the mimetic approach was the idea that culture can have an evolution as well, and that Darwinian approach to evolution is not only valid for biology, but perhaps as well for culture.
See, I have a difficult problem with the very notion of culture or religion, right? See, I don't think these are things. I think what we have are patterns of regularities among populations.
Right.
Um, and these patterns of regularities, which we gloss over as what we call culture, Catalan culture or American culture or whatever it is. And that it's extremely fluid. I mean, you can call it whatever you want, and it can be as specific as one little village or even one little hamlet or one little house to the world at large. I look at it more as an epidemiological approach of ideas and relations between ideas and practices in an environment. And we see these, what I would call eventually statistical regularities and causal chains between these broad groups of phenomena. And so we see similarities, overlapping similarities and patterns of these things. And there I find Darwin extremely relevant. You know, Darwin did not think species exists. Species is a common sense notion that, because of our innate system of biological classification, makes a lot of sense. And in a non-dimensional sense, that is, if you forget all of evolutionary history and just look at what we call species today, they tend not to interbreed, at least among the non-vertebrates. But of course, if you go back in history, they do, and there's no hard division between species. It's a continuous uh, genetic line. So it's a snapshot of a sets of regularities that are comparable uh, at a moment. Now, when you look at it this way, what I see as cultural evolution is basically populations, population dynamics, working in particular types of environments with the cognitive abilities they have and interacting in ways that are peculiarly human. They produce this thing we call culture. Now, for broad comparative purposes and communication, that's fine. But when we get down to the nitty gritty of the science of it, you actually have to spell out how these things are. And one of the things we did in the book, The Native Mind, The Cultural Construction of Nature, is to try to spell out how these regularities actually go from person to person to person and create population st statistical regularities within a population. What is the dynamics of this? And that, I think, is the real scientific, the hard work. And I would make the same claim for evolution. Um, Adaptation stories are not mostly scientific. They're mostly, as I said, just so stories or speculative stories. Take, for example, um, even in biology, uh, the hard part of evolutionary theory in biology is the physics and chemistry of it. So you try to understand why whales and fish, for example, have the forms they do and why they were confused. Well, the physics of it tell you that any object that can be shaped, that flows through a liquid medium, has to take on a bullet shape. Even octopuses, when they move, they have to do that. So the hard part is simply physics. Once you understand the physics of it, then you can start playing with the particular environmental conditions at a particular time and how this mutation led to this mutation. But I find that there's a lot of laziness in it. People don't pay attention to the physics of it. And same in anthropology and culture. People don't pay attention to the actual causal chains. How is it going from mind to mind? What actually is involved? What concepts are actually being shaped? What kinds of populations are involved to put them together?
That's right. Well, if the human mind is something that it is not, is a fax machine, is just repetition of the message that you get. Clearly, we don't do that, obviously. I mean,
No, no, no.
I mean, if you ask my students to repeat the lecture that I had just given, probably you will have as many lectures as the students were listening to it.
Sure, sure. Now you can limit that. For example, when you're in your lecture room, the fact that you are all sitting around a table and that you are the professor and you're trying to get a particular idea is going to limit what these people are able, what your students are able to
Right.
project, right? It's quite different than if someone, puts out a commandment like the Ten Commandments over 4,000 years in many different cultures and histories, and you try to find out what's common to it, then you're out of luck.
Right. Yeah. Now, let me now move to your research in, well, maybe one of the most intractable conflicts in human history, that is the conflict of the Middle East. And you studied Islamic terrorism. And the interesting thing is also that you were using ethnography to study Islamic terrorism, which I, as I said at the beginning, well, that sounds a very dangerous kind of research. What do you think is the contribution that anthropology can make to understand this
Well, let me
terrorism?
give you a little bit of background on this. So, I was a visiting professor at the Hebrew University many years ago. It was in the Shamir prime ministry, um, when he was prime minister. And I was doing land systems in Palestine, disappeared villages. And I had as my assistants um, young men from the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, there were two branches of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was the Gaza branch and the Jordanian branch. And in the Six-Day War, these were separated. So they were forming, when I was there in 1987, they were forming at that moment Hamas. So they were forming Hamas. And they were my assistants. So I knew them from the very, very beginning. And they were being paid for by the Israeli government. And they were being paid for in order to be a counterweight to the PLO, which was a secular organization uh, trying to get separate statehood. And they would tell me something that the Taliban also said. They would tell me, I would say to them, "You mean you think you're going to take over Jerusalem and you're going to get rid of the Jewish state?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely." "And you're taking money from the Israelis to do this?" I said, "Allah works in mysterious ways." I had almost the same experience with the Taliban when I said, "Well, how do you get your money?" And they said, "Well, uh, thank God your country, the United States, gives us money." I said, "How do they do that?" "Well, they give money to the Pakistani intelligence, which gives it to us. And we get it from kidnapping people like you." And I said, "Wow, Allah does work in mysterious ways." That was enough to get me out of the problem then. So when 9/11 happened, there was a huge amount of confusion. I remember the moment it happened, I said to my wife, "Well, the world's going to change now. Um, the United States has been hit, and they're not going to be able to psychologically accept just being hit. And there's going to be a massive reaction, and there's going to be a massive overreaction, of which there was. I mean, 9/11 cost about four to $500,000 in preparation, and the United States has spent between 10 and 20 um, uh, trillion dollars in reshaping armies and
Wow.
dispositions. And so it's immensely asymmetrical. And I sort of predicted this would happen. I wrote about it in the New York Times and many other places, but it happened anyway. So I said to myself, well, again, this is a behavior very different from my own. I don't blow myself up, and I don't know anybody who blows themselves up. I want to understand this and try to explain it, so that we don't make these huge mistakes, political mistakes. So I applied for NSF grant for Emergency National Science Foundation. And of course, there's what's called human subjects reviews, and the university rejected it because I had to get their permission to use American money to study them, and they had to sign a document. So I had to do this on sort of my own. And I got in touch with people I knew in the Hamas, and I got in touch with other people, for example, Khurshid Ahmed, who was a senator, one of the founders of the Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, who I had met at the World Federation of Scientists and who I had gone around to all the sweet shops. And this is the way anthropology works in the wild, right?
Right.
But he didn't want to bring back sweets with alcohol to his family in Pakistan. So he made me taste them all and select them all. So we became
Oh,
friends, and he was able to organize meetings with Al Qaeda associates in Pakistan, Afghanistan. And I was able to do pretty much the same thing in Indonesia with the Bali bombers. And so I was able to work. What could I say? I've done this with right-wing neo-Nazis as well. Uh, the anthropologist's job is to be able to empathize with whatever people they are with, without necessarily didn't sympathize with any of these people,
oh,
but to figure out where they came from, how they got to these beliefs, how they organized themselves. And it was like doing natural history and biology. That is, I had to figure out how each of them hooked up with each of the others, and how through these small group dynamics, they hooked up with Al Qaeda.
mm,
So, for example, I went to visit the apartments and talk to all the people of the 9/11 bombers, and go into the school in Harburg, to go back to their family homes in Saudi Arabia. And I did the same thing with many of these groups. For example, with Hamas suicide bombers, I found out that one entire soccer team became a set of suicide bombers, and how this soccer team, how just being in the soccer team itself, how that created this nucleus that became one of the most deadly suicide bombing squads. How the soccer team in Sudan that bin Laden organized became so powerful. How the Jamaat Islamiyah became organized. So it was following the actual nitty gritty of the individual relationships, how these combined, and how they adopted the ideas they did, under what conditions they did, that I began to understand how this started to work. And then the Security Council, the UN Security Council, asked me, because I had gone to the White House to explain this, because no one was knowing. In fact, I asked the White House whether they would like me to bring in some people from, these organizations. They thought I was from Planet Fruitcake. But the more I tried to do this, and the more I confronted people at the White House and others, the message started to get through. That not any consequences from it. And then the UN Security Council asked me to brief the Security Council members on this, and they started to see what was going on. But the politics behind it was so enormous in terms of sunken costs and revenge and geopolitical questions, that the actual knowledge about who these people were and what they were doing still is pretty much left to the wayside. But my job as an anthropologist was to take this to the political leaders in the world and to explain what the hell was happening, who they were, why they were doing it, how they were doing it. And I also got involved in intelligence work, and I would say, you want to know how to get a cell of potential suicide bombers, crack it, find out what they eat, find out what they wear, find out who's marrying sisters of whom. Then you'll get into the group. Then you'll know what's going on.
that's right. That's right. Well, one of the most terrible things about this Islamic terrorism, or terrorism in general, but specifically in Islamic terrorism, is suicide terrorism. And well, at first sight, it seems that it is very difficult to provide evolutionary explanations for this act. How can anyone do that, and how can that have any I don't know, any relevance, or how that meme, if I can use that expression, can contaminate our minds.
Well,
That's
Darwin wrote Wallace, um, with this question: how do we explain heroism and martyrdom? It
Right.
doesn't seem to make much sense, right? And Wallace's answer was basically metaphysical. There's some power out there, God or something else.
All right.
And Darwin said, no, no, let's try to find something else. And in The Descent of Man, he begins to, I think, get a take on it. Now that's, I think, been overinterpreted in terms of group selection.
That's right.
But basically, what he said was there are certain virtues, values, highly esteemed, even sacred, that give immense advantage to low power groups in their fight against high power groups when stimulated and inspired by devoted actors willing to sacrifice for these values. So, in evolutionary theory, you also get the fact that there are defense mechanisms by weaker creatures which scare off the stronger creatures, right? When you have a little creature and he's willing to sacrifice himself, then the stronger creature says, maybe I'll go to another prey. Um, and we have developed these values, these belief in sacred values, and it's related to religion or nationalism and all these ideologies we have. But it goes a step further. And belief in these values allows us to make extraordinary cooperative efforts at defense or offense. Um, and only if we're willing to sacrifice what Lincoln said, the last full measure of devotion, our lives, the totality of our interests, only if we show that is it an unmistakable symbol, even more than the zbiba, the mark, the Muslim mark on the forehead from praying that's erasable. That belief and that commitment means this person is someone I should depend upon and trust. And if a group of these people do it, it can inspire a whole society, even a weaker society, which I believe is one of the reasons that insurgent groups and revolutionary groups, on average, are able to defeat standard police and armies, which rely on material incentives like pay, promotion, and punishment, with up to 10 times more firepower and manpower. It's only because they believe in these values and are committed to these values that they're able to do it. And suicide terrorism is just one manifestation of this. They actually believe that what they're doing is going to advance what I would call sort of ontological significance of their people, of their group, of their imagined kin group, their motherland, their fatherland, their brothers and sisters, which is actually in Bin Laden's oath. But if you look at human history, if you look at what's taught in war colleges or even in international relations, what do people remember in history? They remember Thermopylae, where 300 Greeks sacrificed themselves against thousands of Persians and they all died. That's considered an heroic act. You look at Masada, where they would rather kill themselves than surrender to the Romans because they did not want to lose their dignity,
Yeah.
and their
Right.
beliefs. You look at the Alamo, even if they had slaves and whatnot, they fought to the death. You look at the Nazi Waffen SS in the defense of Bucharest. They had these death volunteer squads. They were willing to fight the Russians to the death in defense of the crazy ideas, in this case, Nazi ideas, because they believed them. So why do we remember these things? What is it about this? Um, it's that it creates a ceiling notion of who should be trusted, when they should be trusted, and what um, what to what ends human beings are willing to go to defend who they are and what they are. And that is greater than life itself. Thomas Hobbes called this the privilege of absurdity to which no creature but man is subject.
All right.
And I think that if you look across human history, my take on it is that civilizations rise and fall not because of the material means they have necessarily, but because of the values they have and the extent to which they believe in their values. Actually, Ibn Khaldun, who had the first comparative historical study, who was studying why dynasties, military dynasties in North Africa survived, he came to pretty much the same conclusion. Two things were responsible for the survival, long-term survival of a military dynasty of more or less equal military power. One he called asabiya, which is a sense of kinship. And the other was their belief in the values they held, din, their religion, because religion was the overwhelming expression of values at that time. And I think these two things, which are eminently measurable. I mean, one of the things I do, if you look at that I did in Congress and at the White House, was every time America lost a war, Vietnam or Iraq to an extent, or Afghanistan, there's always a congressional hearing where the conclusion is, well, we gave them everything we thought they needed. We gave them training and we gave them guns and we gave them money, but they still lost. Why did they lose? And the conclusion was always they didn't have the will to fight. You can find this in Biden's statements, Obama's statements, general chiefs of staff statements. And then there's a congressional inquiry, and they say, well, will to fight is just this impossibly imponderable notion. And my job here in this particular aspect of cognitive anthropology is to say, no, we can measure it. And there are very simple measures to figure out what's going on. And those measures, I didn't get a priori. Those measures I got on the battlefield. And that's why, well, it's dangerous, yes, but it's necessary. If you're not on the battlefield and you're just, I don't know, imagining what's going on or reading reports, you get more in a few minutes, let me tell you, in a battle, on the battlefield, seeing what's going on in that chaos than you do from reading mountains of books. Mm-hmm. So what I try to do is what really makes sense here in the heat of battle. Why are these people, why are these Al-Qaeda Ingamasi, which are called the penetrators, why are they willing to penetrate and go to their deaths? Why is the PKK, which is a Kurdish secular Marxist group, why are they the only ones able to hold them off? Especially the women snipers. You know, right. What is it about their beliefs and their organization which allows them to do this? And so by working with them, I came with measures that we got from evolutionary theory. For example, there's this one measure where if you have a slide or a set of sequential paper diagrams of someone getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or stronger and stronger and stronger, and you find out to what extent they're willing to resist or not resist, or willing to flee or not flee. So I gave this, for example, to different groups: Shia militia, Sunni militia, Iraqi army, American army, Germans, PKK, Al-Qaeda. And two groups basically threw the thing away and said, this is not important. It was the PKK and the Al-Qaeda. And I mean ISIS, the Islamic State, which is a red. And they said, that's not important. I said, well, so what's important? And they said, Ruhi Bighera, your commitment, your internal commitment to what you believe in, which is basically the translation, or their spiritual form. So I had to invent a measure of spiritual formidability to oppose it to this physical measure from evolutionary theory. And with regular armies and most groups, the physical formidability is the best predictor of what people will do, but not for these groups. It was the spiritual formidability. It was a measure that we got only in the field. So that's one of the reasons you have to be in the field. The second and more general reason is the biggest problem in social science is the gap between what people say and what people do.
What do?
It's less a problem in anthropology than in all the other social sciences like sociology and psychology, where they use measures, but they actually don't. And for fighting and for sacrifice, there's almost no attempt to fill this gap, except, well, in the military, it's really pathetic. But in the literature or in studies, it's mostly classroom studies where people imagine they're on the battlefield or whatnot. It's mostly junk. It's irrelevant. And the only way you can get it is to be there and to do it in the field and see what they actually do. So we can actually measure who's dying, who's fighting with their limbs lost. Then we have a real measure of commitment, not a Likert scale that says, I'm willing to do this up to 0.6 versus 7. You see, this guy actually, these fighters lost their limbs or they sacrificed their family, which we found. So we're actually able to take our measures, our survey measures, they're actually experimental measures, and to check them against actual performance on the battlefield. Then what we do is we go back to the more massive surveys, like we recently did in Taiwan, on their willingness to resist the Chinese, and we test these out in um, neuroimaging studies. Why neuroimaging? Because neuroimaging studies, just like battlefield studies, you can't do posturing. You can't fake it. So the neuroimaging studies allow us to validate in a second way what we find in the field with our validation measures on the battlefield. And what we found, of course, is they work perfectly together. Neuroimaging studies have an additional slight advantage of serendipity. That is, sometimes it can reveal neural pathways, things happening that we didn't imagine were happening. For example, revenge and joy. We found so suicide bombers feel joy,
Right.
okay, when
Right.
they do, and supporters of suicide bombings feel joy.
Right.
And we actually measured this of time at checkpoints in the West Bank and in Gaza. Support for suicide bombing went off the longer people stayed at checkpoints,
Right.
and their joy at hearing of a suicide bombing increased. But when we did the neuroimaging, we find that revenge, you know, uh, priming for revenge, uh, activates the same neural circuits.
Right.
So that was just interesting, serendipitous finding. But we find these things all the time. Neuroimaging isn't just a waste of time. It actually can validate things
Right.
against posturing and lead to discoveries that you hadn't imagined before. So that's why we try to combine all these different things. Being in the field, when we do studies, for example, of suicide bombers or supporters of suicide bombers in Europe, which we've done, or in North Africa, we actually have to go for a year or two in the field, embed ourselves in the field, gain the trust of people. And it's only after a year or two that you can take them out and put them in an fMRI machine.
Mhm.
So it's a long process, but worthwhile.
Good. Good. Good, Scott. This has been terrific, but I'm afraid our time is finished. It has been a big honor, a pleasure, and a privilege to have this conversation with you. But we have to leave it here. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And thanks to Montse Martes for her technical assistance. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you, Montse. Merci.
Thank you.
Adeu.